We are good to go, Rob.
Imagine you're in the jungle. There's bugs everywhere. You're 9,000 miles away from home, and you're fighting a war. No one wants you to fight this war. Not the people at your home, not the people in the country you're fighting with, not even the opposing country. That's the Vietnam War. With the war in Ukraine and Israel, I think it's important to look at the Vietnam War and everything it represents and everything going forward with how we might go into the future. If history's persistence to repeat itself, it's important to remember the failures that happened in the Vietnam War. I did research through the National Archive, Britannica, and History Channel to get a good timeline on the Vietnam War, and I think it's important to view it chronologically by setting up its context and its history, the actual war itself, and what outcomes it led to on both sides. To understand the Vietnam War, it's important to look at the context that led up to it. In World War II, Japan imperial forces invaded Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, a communist leader, was inspired and created the Viet Minh. The U.S. supported the Viet Minh in the war against Japan and provided a lot of ammunition and various materials to help support their fight against the Japanese imperial forces. Following Japan's surrender, September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The declaration paraphrased the U.S. Declaration of Independence, including stuff such as all men are created equal. Following this, French forces invaded southern Vietnam and entered talks with the Vietnamese Communist Party. They sought control over Vietnam as a whole, and they were looking to regain it as originally they were a colony of France. Both sides seek to unify Vietnam, however, talks quickly broke down following the differences in opinion on Vietnam's future. This led to conflict between communist North Vietnam and the Western-backed South Vietnam. France backed out of Vietnam following the decisive victory of the Viet Minh in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The 57-day battle saw 2,200 French forces dead and about 11,000 captured who later died in captivity. The U.S. began its entrance into Vietnam in June of 1954, often considered when Air Force Colonel Edward Lanslin conducted paramilitary operations using Green Berets to help train South Vietnamese forces. Ngo Dinh Diem was appointed president following the Geneva Convention that divided Vietnam on the 17th parallel. He was appointed, however, with very corrupt practices, and it's very considered that he appointed himself into the government. His government was supported by the U.S., however, in its efforts to curb communism in the Cold War. He did face insurgency under the Viet Cong and began the Strategic Hamlet program, which faced massive backlash from the citizens of Vietnam. He also was a Christian, one of the reasons why he was backed in the first place, and he curbed the Buddhist population, which is why you have famous pictures like that one of Buddhist priests burning themselves alive to protest. On the 1st of November 1963, South Vietnamese generals led a coup d'etat, which ultimately ended with Diem and his brother dead. Going back a little bit, however, the Viet Cong was created as a result of Diem's arrest, torture, and eventual execution of around 100,000 South Vietnamese citizens. By 1957, the Viet Cong had become organized as an insurgency group and started attacking government officials strategically. In 1959, they started to engage the South Vietnamese army in firefights. Eventually, the Viet Cong transitioned to the NLF, or the National Liberation Front, claiming they were independent from many. The U.S. intelligence, such as the CIA, believed that they were actually controlled by North Vietnamese forces. Kennedy, in 1961, after receiving reports of the situation in Vietnam, began to ramp up his military intervention. However, he was apprehensive to send more boots on the ground than really necessary. So in 1962, U.S. military presence in Vietnam had reached 9,000 troops comparative to the 800 available in the 1950s. However, following the coup of Diem in 1963, Kennedy was assassinated 3 weeks later. This is often believed to be one of the reasons why Kennedy was assassinated, if you're into conspiracy theories. Following Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson, vice president, became president, and Robert McNamara began to ramp up the U.S. involvement. Robert McNamara, of course, being the cabinet member of defense. And in 1964, after supposed reports of torpedo boats attacking U.S. vessels, Johnson ordered retaliatory bombings, often called Operation Rolling Thunder, in the pass of the Gulf Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson the power to do this. In 1964 to 1973, the U.S. dropped 2 million tons of bombs on Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was used to supply the Viet Cong. Often these bombings were reported to be ineffective, as there was no way of knowing if they actually did anything. In March of 1965, the U.S. public support of Johnson sent 82,000 soldiers to Vietnam to be stationed. Amid the growing anti-war concerns, Johnson further sent 200,000 more soldiers by the end of 1966. Countries such as Thailand, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand also sent soldiers, but not nearly in as large quantities. Despite the air raids in the north, the South was mainly fought on foot under the orders of General William Westmoreland. Westmoreland aimed to fight a battle in which the U.S. soldiers killed as many South Vietnamese Viet Cong as possible in order to demoralize them. However, this was often ineffective, and the soldiers would propagate higher reports of dead than was actually considered in order to earn more freedom. This led to the creation of what were called fire-free zones, in which there were supposed to be no citizens. However, this often was not the case. And these areas were bombed, and cities were flooded with refugees coming from these areas. Despite the rising casualties, the Viet Cong often remained to fight, as they did with extreme vigor, and what was reported by some airmen as the right side. Back on American soil, there was widespread anti-war protest. American casualties rose in 1966, 15,000. This led to the televised horror of Vietnam. On January 31st, 1968, 70,000 North Vietnamese soldiers led the Tet Offensive. This was connected a coordinated attack of 100 South Vietnamese citizens. Nixon began Vietnamization, which was the withdrawal of soldiers from Vietnam. This was only further built by the My Lai Massacre. After all, the Vietnam War only ended in 1973, nearly 19 years after it began. However, the war had devastating effects on both sides. The Vietnamese faced 2 million dead, 3 million casualties, and 12 million refugees. The U.S. lost its myth of American invincibility, and many returning veterans faced negative effects. Ending it, it's clear to see that Vietnam War was one of true loss, unfortunate circumstances for all parties involved. From the lead up to the hopeful party wanting to be free, Vietnam became an unfortunate war on both the U.S. and Vietnamese side. Many of you have heard the history, and knowing so, I truly hope that you take this information when considering future political affairs. And when looking at the Vietnam War, seeing the conflicts in Israel with the Hamas and conflicts in Ukraine, I hope that you can take Vietnam as a matter to consider. Thank you.
Okay.